The town of Millbrook, Ohio sits quietly between the cornfields and the county line. 4,000 people. One stoplight. A church on every other corner. The kind of place where neighbors still wave at each other from their porches and nobody locks their doors before 9. It is, by every measure, the kind of town where nothing bad is supposed to happen. But something bad was happening. It was a Tuesday morning in early October when Linda Carter found her daughter Emma sitting on the back porch steps, arms wrapped around her stomach, crying in a way that mothers recognize immediately, not from pain, but from something deeper. Something that doesn't have a name yet. Emma was 19 years old. She had brown hair and her father's eyes and a habit of finishing her homework before dinner. She didn't go to parties. She didn't have a boyfriend. She barely left the house except for school and church. She was, by every definition her parents knew, a good girl living a quiet life. And yet something was very wrong. Robert Carter loaded his daughter into his pickup truck and drove her to the Millbrook Medical Clinic on Main Street without saying much. He just held her hand across the center console and told her everything was going to be okay. He believed it when he said it. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had been practicing medicine in Millbrook for 18 years. She had delivered babies and set broken bones and sat with families through the worst nights of their lives. She was not a woman who was easily shaken. But when she came out of that examination room and asked Robert and Linda to sit down, something in her face made Linda reach for her husband's hand before the doctor even opened her mouth. Emma was pregnant. Robert Carter is not a man who shows a lot of emotion. He grew up on that farm, worked it his whole life, raised his daughter there. But in that hallway of the Millbrook Medical Clinic, with the fluorescent lights humming above him, he stood completely still for a long time and said nothing. Because it wasn't possible. It simply wasn't possible. Emma had not been with anyone. She had not dated, had not snuck out, had not been anywhere she wasn't supposed to be. Her parents would have known. They were the kind of family that knew. Dr. Mitchell ran the test twice. The result was the same both times. That evening, in the living room of the Carter farmhouse, Robert sat across from his daughter and asked her to look at him. And Emma looked at her father and told him, through tears, that she did not understand what was happening. That there was no one. That she was telling the truth. And Robert Carter believed his daughter. Because he had raised her. And because deep in his gut, something told him this was not her story to explain. It was someone else's crime to confess. The Carter family was not alone. In the weeks that followed, it became clear that what had happened to Emma was not an isolated incident. Across Millbrook, families were having the same impossible conversations. Young women with no boyfriends, no relationships, no unexplained absences, turning up pregnant. 15 of them. All between 17 and 22 years old. All from families who watched their daughters carefully, who locked their doors, who slept in the same houses. Sean Harper had lived in Millbrook his whole life. He coached Little League. He organized the 4th of July parade. He knew everyone on his street by name. When his own daughter came to him with the same story, the same confusion, the same fear, the same absence of any explanation, he didn't fall apart. He started counting. He went door to door. He talked to fathers and mothers who were too ashamed to have spoken to anyone yet. And when he had counted 15 families, all carrying the same secret, all asking the same unanswerable question, he drove to Columbus. The Franklin County Sheriff's Department is housed in a 3-story building on Mound Street in Columbus, Ohio. It is a professional, modern law enforcement office. American flag in the lobby. Photographs of past sheriffs on the wall. And behind a desk on the 2nd floor, Sheriff Patricia Dawson. Trish Dawson had been in law enforcement for 22 years. She had worked her way from patrol officer to detective to the office she now held. She was not easily surprised. She had heard extraordinary things in that office, things that turned out to be true, and things that turned out to be something else entirely. She knew how to tell the difference. When Sean Harper sat across from her and told her what was happening in Millbrook, she listened without interrupting. She asked clear questions. She took notes. And when he was finished, she was quiet for a moment in the way that people are quiet when they are deciding whether to believe something that challenges everything they understand about the world. She believed him. She sent Deputy Mike Reyes and Deputy Carla Brooks to Millbrook that same afternoon. They spent the day moving through the town, knocking on doors, interviewing families, inspecting homes. They checked windows and door locks and fence lines. They looked for signs of forced entry and found none. Every door had been locked from the inside. Every window was intact. There was no physical evidence that anyone had entered these homes without permission. But there was something else. Something small that kept coming up in the interviews. Multiple residents. People who didn't know each other well, from different streets, different houses, all said the same thing. They had been sleeping unusually deeply. For the past 4 months, they had been waking up tired, as if the night had passed without them. Light sleepers who suddenly slept through alarms. Parents who prided themselves on waking at the smallest sound, hearing nothing. Deputy Reyes drove back to Columbus that evening and sat across from Sheriff Dawson and said the word they had both been thinking. Chemical sedation. Someone was putting these families to sleep. Not violently. Not messily. Quietly. Efficiently. With something that left no trace and no memory. And then, while those families lay unconscious in their own homes, surrounded by the people they trusted, in the beds where they were supposed to be safest, someone was coming in. Sheriff Dawson sat in her office for a long time after Reyes left. She turned a pen over in her fingers. She looked at the file on her desk. She thought about Emma Carter and 14 other young women in a small Ohio town who had woken up one morning to find their lives permanently changed, and had not known why, and had not had the words to explain it, and had been afraid that no one would believe them. Then she made a decision. She was going to Millbrook herself. Not in her uniform. Not in her cruiser. Not as the sheriff of Franklin County. She was going as someone no one would notice. She told Reyes and Brooks to keep their phones on. She told them her location and said that if she didn't check in by 2 in the morning, they were to send every available unit to Millbrook immediately. She told no one else. No radio chatter. No department emails. This was between the 3 of them. That evening, Patricia Dawson drove to Millbrook in a personal vehicle, parked on the edge of town, and walked in on foot wearing worn civilian clothes. An oversized gray hoodie. Jeans with tears at the knee. Old sneakers. Her hair pulled back. She looked like a woman who had been traveling for a long time and had nowhere particular to be. She knocked on a door on Maple Drive and asked if she could sleep on the porch. The homeowner, a cautious man who had been keeping a closer eye on his neighborhood than usual, looked her over and then let her inside. She settled onto the couch in the living room. The family went to bed. The house went quiet. She did not sleep. The clock on the wall moved slowly. 11. Midnight. 1 in the morning. The neighborhood was still. And then, from somewhere down the block, a dog started barking. Then another. And then silence again. The kind of silence that feels like it was suddenly imposed. She moved to the window. 2 men in dark clothing were walking along the fence line of a house 2 doors down. They moved with a kind of casual confidence that comes from having done something many times before. They knew the yard. They knew where to step. They knew which window faced the backyard. She watched one of them pull a small canister from his jacket. She watched him crouch at the base of a window and lift the screen with practiced ease and spray something through the gap. She watched them wait, 30 seconds, 40, and then try the back door. It opened. She moved into position. 15 minutes later, the two men came out. They were relaxed. Easy. The way people are when they believe they are completely invisible. Patricia Dawson stepped out of the shadows and stood directly in front of them. She identified herself as law enforcement. She told them not to move. The larger of the two men looked at her clothes and laughed. He called her homeless. He told her to get out of the way. She put him on the ground before he finished the sentence. She called for backup. She called for the neighbors. And as porch lights began flickering on across the street, as doors opened and people in pajamas and bathrobes came out to see what was happening, she reached into the waistband of her worn jeans and held up her badge. She was not homeless. She was the sheriff of Franklin County. And she had just watched these two men commit the crime that had destroyed 15 families. Deputies Reyes and Brooks arrived within minutes with 3 cruisers. The suspects were identified as Jake Mercer, 34 years old, from Dayton, and Danny Cole, 31 years old, from Cincinnati. They were placed in handcuffs on the same street where they had believed, right up until that moment, that they were untouchable. The families of Millbrook stood in their yards in the middle of the night and watched the men who had been inside their homes being loaded into the back of a sheriff's cruiser. Some of them cried. Some of them couldn't speak. Robert Carter stood on the sidewalk with his arm around his wife and looked at the two men and said nothing at all. At the Franklin County Sheriff's Department the following morning, Jake Mercer and Danny Cole sat across from Sheriff Dawson in a room with fluorescent lights and a metal table and a digital recorder and no windows. They had lawyers. They had rights. And eventually, faced with the testimony of the sheriff who had personally witnessed their crime, faced with the canister recovered from the scene and sent to the state lab in Columbus for analysis, faced with the weight of what they had done multiplied by 15, they talked. They had found the chemical compound online. It was an industrial-grade aerosol sedative, the kind used on large animals. Danny Cole had read about it somewhere and decided to test it. They had driven to Millbrook 4 months ago for no particular reason except that it was small and quiet and far from anywhere they were known. They would identify a house during the day. Come back at night. Spray the compound through a window gap or a door crack or a vent. Wait 2 minutes. The compound dispersed quickly and settled low, putting everyone in the house into a deep, dreamless sleep, no sensation, no awareness, no memory. Then they would enter. They had done it in Millbrook more than 20 times. The Franklin County prosecutor filed charges that same week. Criminal sexual assault in the first degree, 20 counts. Aggravated burglary. Use of a chemical agent to facilitate criminal acts. Conspiracy. The charges were filed in the Court of Common Pleas, Franklin County, Ohio. The case was assigned to Judge Harold Warren. Columbus News Channel 4 ran the story on a Wednesday evening. Reporter Angela Ford sat at the anchor desk with a photograph of Millbrook behind her and reported that 2 men had been arrested in connection with a series of crimes affecting at least 15 families in a small rural community outside Columbus. She reported that the arresting officer had been working undercover. She reported that the sheriff of Franklin County had knocked on a stranger's door in worn civilian clothes and spent the night on their couch waiting for something to happen. The story spread. It crossed the state. It crossed the country. People who had never heard of Millbrook, Ohio shared it with each other because it was the kind of story that touches something fundamental, the idea that someone had gone looking for the truth in the dark, alone, and had found it. 6 weeks later, the families of Millbrook filled the gallery of the Franklin County Courthouse. They came in their good clothes. They sat together. Some of them had not seen each other since the summer, having retreated into their own private grief, and being in the same room together felt like something, not healing exactly, but the beginning of the possibility of it. Sean Harper read the victim's family's statement. He stood at the front of that courtroom and spoke for 15 families and said what they had all been carrying, that they had done everything right. That they had locked their doors and watched over their daughters and had still not been able to protect them. That this was not their failure. That they were not asking for revenge. They were asking for the one thing that had been taken from them along with everything else. The truth, acknowledged in public, by a court of law. Judge Harold Warren sentenced Jake Mercer and Danny Cole to 40 years in the Ohio State Penitentiary, without the possibility of parole for a minimum of 30 years. He said that the crimes committed represented a profound violation of human dignity. He said that the planning involved, the duration, the number of victims, all of it constituted aggravating factors of the highest degree. And he said something else. He said that he wanted the record to be clear. The families of Millbrook had done nothing wrong. They had been targeted with deliberation and sophistication by people who had counted on their trust and their safety and their sleep to protect themselves. That trust, he said, would not be rewarded. Not in his courtroom. Not in this state. Outside the courthouse, in the Columbus afternoon, Emma Carter stood with her parents and looked up at the sky for a long moment. She didn't say anything. Then she took her father's arm and they walked down the courthouse steps together. Sheriff Dawson was standing near her cruiser when Sean Harper came to find her. He shook her hand and told her that if she hadn't come to Millbrook that night, if she hadn't gone in alone, in the dark, dressed like a stranger, they might never have caught them. She told him that wasn't true. She told him they would have been caught eventually. And then she said something that he would repeat many times in the years that followed, to anyone who asked him what the sheriff of Franklin County had been like. She said, "I didn't do anything that any one of you wouldn't have done for your daughters. I just happened to have a badge." 1 month later, Millbrook looked like Millbrook again. Kids on bikes on Maple Drive. Neighbors talking over fences. The diner on Main Street filling up on Sunday mornings. The cornfields turning gold in the late October light. Emma Carter walked down the sidewalk on a Tuesday afternoon with her head up. She stopped and looked at the town around her, the water tower, the church steeple, the houses where she knew every family by name. A neighbor waved at her from across the street. She waved back. She was not the same person she had been before September. She knew that. She would carry what had happened to her for the rest of her life, in ways she was only beginning to understand. But she was walking. She was outside. She was not hiding. And somewhere in Columbus, in the office on the second floor of the Franklin County Sheriff's Department, Patricia Dawson was at her desk with another file open in front of her. Another case. Another town. Another family that needed someone to believe them. She was listening. Because that is the thing about darkness. No matter how carefully it is arranged, no matter how long it believes itself invisible, it cannot survive a single person who is willing to walk into it and look. The town of Millbrook, Ohio is quiet again. 4,000 people. 1 stoplight. American flags on every porch. And every door locked. Not from fear. From the simple knowledge that they had asked for help, and help had come. If you or someone you know has experienced something that doesn't make sense, something you're afraid no one will believe, please tell someone anyway. The RNN National Sexual Assault Hotline is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, at 1-800-656-4673. You do not have to carry this alone.